I know that I've gone on for quite a long time, but you know it's not over yet. You've got to give me another 10 minutes, okay? So as I said, Reb Nachman of Breslov did not believe in dynastic Hasidic systems. In other words, just because you're a Hasidic Rebbe doesn't entitle your child to become a Hasidic Rebbe. Just because you happen to be from a famous family doesn't make your family any more distinguished than the sum of its parts. You are distinguished because you yourself are distinguished. So when he died, the Hasidim decided, no Rebbe. Reb Nachman was the Rebbe. Reb Nachman was the tzaddik. How can we replace him? And Reb Nosson Nemirova developed a system that was called the Toiter Chasidus, the dead Hasidic group. The Hasidic group that worships a dead Rebbe. And there was never another Breslover Rebbe. In fact, he was not the Breslover Rebbe, he was Reb Nachman of Breslov. And the Hasidic group remained very small but very devoted and continued to follow in the path of first Reb Nosson and then other prominent Breslov Hasidim, and each generation would produce its own. Sometimes there were factions, sometimes they came together, but ultimately their loyalty was not to an individual, but to the teachings of Reb Nachman of Breslov. Okay, very nice, but what happened to his children? It's a good question, right? What happened to Reb Nachman of Breslov's descendants? So he wasn't succeeded by a son-in-law. He had daughters, he only had daughters, his son died. So I did some research. I love doing research. I belong to lots of genealogical websites and all kinds of research websites which I use to garner information, to get information about the people I'm going to be speaking about. And I looked at the websites and tried to get some picture of who the descendants of Reb Nachman of Breslov were. And I came up with some really, really shocking information, but I'm going to come back to that, okay? First, I want to introduce you to an actress from Australia called Lisa McCune. Now, I don't know if there's any Australians here. Maybe there'll be those watching or listening. Lisa McCune is very famous because she was Constable Maggie Doyle in a program on TV called Blue Heelers. She was also Lieutenant Kate McGregor in another TV series called Sea Patrol. She's won lots of awards in Australia, and she was born in 1971. And in 2016, she featured as a celebrity in an episode of a TV series that's called Who Do You Think You Are? Have you ever heard of that? Who Do You Think You Are is celebrity ancestry. So it goes to a celebrity and suddenly they discover that they're descended from a cleaning lady. Their great-grandmother was a cleaning lady to a famous prime minister. Or they discover that they're related to the British royal family, right? It's one of the two or somewhere in between. Anyway, she was the central celebrity in an episode of Who Do You Think You Are? And she discovers that her great-grandfather is a man called George Christopher Bloomer. Wow. George Christopher Bloomer. Can you see the picture up there? George Christopher Bloomer. There in his military uniform. He was accused of murder in the year 1908, and the person he murdered, you'll be pleased to know, was Bill Clinton. There was a sensational trial in which the real murderer was discovered and sentenced to death, and this George Christopher Bloomer, Lisa McCune's great-grandfather, was given 6 months as an accessory. Apparently he assisted somewhat in the taking the body and hiding it so that nobody should find it. Well, there you go. That's the story. He enlisted in World War I. He was wounded right away, and he re-enlisted in 1916. And he was wounded again, and then he was mustard gassed in France in 1917, and he returned to Australia in 1918. He went through quite a lot, this poor chap, George Christopher Bloomer. And you're probably wondering, why is any of this relevant? Can we have the first family tree? There you go. George Christopher Bloomer. His son was Colin George. His grandson was Malcolm. And his great-granddaughter is Lisa McCune. Can we have the second family tree, please? Okay, there you go. George Christopher Bloomer's mother was Mary Jane Bloomer, whose mother was Bridget Kellington, and her parents were Mary Brennan, real name Miriam, daughter of Chaya Klutzkar-Zaslavsky, whose father was Reb Nachman of Breslov. Now, who did she marry? Miriam married Michael Brennan. His name wasn't actually Michael. His name was Moshe. And his father was Reb Nosson of Nemirov. Now, you're wondering, how do you get from Nemirov to Brennan? Can we have the next slide, please? No, the next one. Oh, there you go. Brennan, Ben Reb Nosson Nemirov. Amazing, isn't it, what you can find out? So Lisa McCune is descended from Reb Nachman of Breslov. By the way, that did not come up in the TV program. Now, if you look at these websites, and I've just taken a snapshot of some of the websites, there is an entire industry of websites dedicated to finding Reb Nachman of Breslov's descendants. I bet you didn't know that. I didn't know it. And you can't imagine the things that they say about Reb Nachman of Breslov's descendants. You see, how did Michael Brennan marry Mary? Do you know how that happened? Because they fell under the influence of the son of the Alter Rebbe of Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, Reb Moshe ben Reb Shneir Zalman, who changed his name from Moshe ben Shneir Zalman and became a Catholic and was a malign influence in the Hasidic world because despite the fact that nobody converted in those days, can you imagine? People did convert to Christianity to further their careers and their livelihoods. And he managed to convert an entire swathe of Hasidic Jews in Eastern Europe, including the son of Reb Nosson Nemirover and the granddaughter of Reb Nachman of Breslov. And they moved to Ireland, where they changed their name to Brennan. And then they had all these children, including this George Christopher Bloomer, who killed Bill Clinton in 1908. Didn't, by the way. He wasn't found guilty. The problem is, of course, that none of this is true. And for all of you amateur researchers out there who use genealogical websites, you really need to know what you're doing. Because if you look at genealogical websites, I'll give you just this one, Jenny.com, of which I'm a member, lists Reb Nachman of Breslov as having had 10 children. But we know he only had 8. So how does he have 10 children? Well, it's really important that he has 10 children if you want some of his descendants to be Frankist, Sabbatean Catholics who live in Ireland. Because otherwise, where are they going to come from? So they invent family trees which trace their way back to great Hasidic rabbis, and then they produce so-called information, but which are really conspiracy theories, that promote the idea that these great rabbis. In fact, one of the websites describes Reb Nachman as having traveled with his second wife in 1808 and converted to Catholicism together with all his children, and therefore all his descendants are also Christians. But that's not enough. You see, it's not sufficient for me to just dismiss it on the basis of me not believing it. I want to give you it's circumstantial evidence, but then again, don't consider the fact that any of this evidence is online as being anything more than circumstantial evidence. First of all, Reb Nosson Nemirover wrote extensively about himself. We have his letters. He doesn't mention anywhere that he had a son called Moshe. I think he would have probably known had he had a son called Moshe. Doesn't mention him anywhere. He does mention Moshe, the son of Reb Shneir Zalman. That means the one who confirmed. We know that that's true. That story is true. That did happen. He mentions him, but not in connection with anything connected to him. He just mentions him as this aberrant son of a great Hasidic leader. Breslov, as I haven't described, but which I think was evident from the life of Reb Nachman, it went on to be one of the most fiercely opposed Hasidic groups in the history of Hasidism. On that basis, don't you think if Reb Nachman had a granddaughter and Reb Nosson had a son who converted to Catholicism, that we would have heard about it then, that we wouldn't have had to wait until Jenny.com came up with it in the year 2018. Reb Noson's son marrying Reb Nachman's granddaughter, I think, would have been something that might have been mentioned in Breslov literature. That's quite something. The main disciple's son marries the granddaughter of the founding rabbi. That's quite a story, not mentioned once anywhere. And finally, Frankism, which seems to have been the source of all this, was long over by the early 1800s, and the idea that Reb Nachman or any of his descendants would have flirted with Frankism or Sabbateanism after the year 1800 is frankly ridiculous. Now, I'm not saying that Reb Nachman doesn't have any descendants who are either irreligious or could be Gentiles. It's possible. Anything is possible. But you certainly can't take the word of some amateur genealogist who's looking for an interesting antecedent to spice up their family tree as gospel truth. Thank you.